Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your anxious thoughts are messing with your ability to remember things, especially visual stuff? Well, this new study dives deep into that exact question. This research basically asks, does the way you experience anxiety, like that worrying feeling in your head or the racing heart in your chest, make a difference in how well you can remember visual information? They're looking at something called visual working memory, which is kind of your brain's short-term notepad for things you see. Imagine you see a bunch of colorful shapes. Visual working memory helps you keep track of not just the colors and shapes individually, but also which color goes with which shape. This research figured that anxiety might mess with the way our brain pays attention, and that attention is super important for remembering these visual details. They made a really interesting distinction. They looked at two types of trait anxiety. Trait anxiety means it is a more regular part of your personality, not just something you feel in a specific moment. They separated it into cognitive anxiety, which is more about your thoughts and worries, and somatic anxiety, which is more about the physical feelings like a faster heartbeat or tense muscles. The theory is that anxiety, especially the worrying kind, can hijack our attention. It pulls our focus away from what we need to remember and onto those distracting anxious thoughts. This could mean we're not as good at controlling where our attention goes, which is a big part of working memory. Now, how did they test this? They used a few different experiments, but a key one involved showing people sequences of colored shapes. Then, they'd ask them to recall what they saw. They played around with the conditions to see how different types of anxiety might affect memory. In the first couple of experiments, they used a method where people had to recall specific items from a sequence. They even tried to encourage participants to focus on certain items more than others, to see if anxiety made it harder to control where attention was directed. They also introduced a visual suffix, which is like a little extra image flashed at the end, to see if anxiety made people more easily distracted by irrelevant stuff. Interestingly, these first two experiments didn't show any clear link between anxiety and performance when people had to verbally recall the information. This meant they needed a different approach. So, in experiments 3 and 4, they switched things up. Instead of asking participants to verbally recall, they used a recognition task. This is where you see a potential item and have to say, yes, I saw that, or no, I didn't. They also changed the number of items people had to remember, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. To see if anxiety affected performance differently based on how much information was being processed. This is where it gets really interesting. They compared memory for individual features, like just remembering the color red versus memory for bindings, which is remembering that a red circle was shown. That is the really complex part of visual working memory, connecting those features together. And here's the big finding for cognitive anxiety, the worry type. They saw something unexpected. People who reported higher levels of cognitive anxiety were actually better at remembering individual features, like just the color. But for somatic anxiety, the physical type, it was the opposite. People with higher somatic anxiety were worse at remembering those complex color-shaped bindings. Scroll in experiment 4, the effect of cognitive load on binding was assessed, number repetition versus backwards counting composite. They also tested how adding extra mental tasks like counting backward affected memory. Again, they found that somatic anxiety was linked to worse performance on the binding tasks when people had to do these extra mental exercises. So, what does this all mean? The researchers concluded that the physical symptoms of anxiety, the somatic ones, seem to be a stronger predictor of deficits in remembering complex visual information, specifically how features are bound together. Cognitive anxiety, on the other hand, actually seemed to help with remembering simpler features. One of the key takeaways is that how you test memory matters. The recognition tasks, where you have to say yes or no, seemed more sensitive to anxiety's effects than the verbal recall tasks. This might be because recognition tasks can be more easily disrupted by distractions or lapses in attention, which anxiety can influence. The study really highlights that anxiety isn't a single thing. The way we experience it matters. Somatic anxiety, with its physical manifestations, seems to directly interfere with the complex process of binding visual information. That internal physical state might be so distracting or demanding that it pulls resources away from constructing those combined features in our mind's eye. Think about it, when your body is buzzing with anxious energy, it's hard to focus on the delicate details of a red square and a blue circle and know they belong together. That internal physical stress itself might be the distraction, or it might make it harder for you to allocate the mental effort needed to maintain those combined features. The researchers also noted that in their first 2 experiments, which used verbal recall, they didn't find any effects of anxiety. This suggests that the specific demands of the task and the way memory is measured are crucial in revealing these anxiety cognition links. Now, no study is perfect. A big limitation here was that data collection for some experiments had to stop early because of COVID-19. This means the sample sizes were a bit smaller than they had planned, and with a smaller sample, it's harder to be super confident about the findings. They also mentioned that the way they presented the visual items varied a little between experiments, which might have played a role. And while they controlled for things like repeating numbers to block rehearsal, they also pointed out that sometimes anxiety's effects might show up more strongly when participants aren't trying to suppress their internal thoughts. So what is the big takeaway? Anxiety, particularly the somatic kind, can indeed interfere with our ability to remember visual information, specifically when it comes to combining different features. It's not just about worrying thoughts. The physical sensations of anxiety can also impact our mental workspace. This is important because visual working memory is fundamental to so many daily tasks, from reading to navigating complex environments. Understanding how anxiety affects it can help us develop better strategies for managing both anxiety and cognitive challenges. It also reminds us that when we're thinking about how anxiety affects people, we need to consider the distinct ways anxiety can manifest, both in the mind and in the body. They're suggesting that maybe in the future, if someone is struggling with tasks that require combining visual information, checking in on their somatic anxiety symptoms could be really useful. This is a really fascinating glimpse into how our internal states can shape our perception and memory of the world around us. It really underscores the interconnectedness of our minds and bodies. What do you think about these findings? Have you noticed your own anxiety affecting your visual memory? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a like and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. We'll see you in the next one.